All right, let's dive into the stack of sources you've given us on the Great Depression.
Yeah, it looks like someone wants to really get into it, not just, the basic story.
Definitely. We've got excerpts from history.com to set the scene.
But then you get into some serious analysis with this Econ Lib piece on the gold standard.
And of course, we can't forget the global perspective, right?
Absolutely. That paper from the London School of Economics adds a whole other dimension.
Plus, we've even got a book from the Mises Institute, so we're going to be looking at things from the Austrian school point of view, too.
Oh, yeah, that's going to get interesting.
So, for this deep dive, we're going to be covering the general timeline of the Great Depression
Starting in 1929.
and lasting until 1939, a full decade.
But what's really fascinating here, and what your sources really dig into, is what was going on before the crash.
Yeah, those pre-crash years are key to understanding the whole thing.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at economic policies, that global interconnectedness, especially that gold standard.
And even how public perception played a role, too, how people were feeling about the economy.
Exactly. By the end of this, you'll have a solid understanding of not just the what, but the why.
And who knows, maybe you'll even be able to apply some of these insights to today's economy.
Well, one thing that jumps out right away is that the U.S. wasn't the only one struggling in the late 1920s.
Oh, really? I kind of thought it was mainly an American thing.
Nope, not at all. By 1928, Germany was having problems. Brazil, too. Even Southeast Asia was in a depression. It was global.
Wow, that's interesting. So what was connecting all these different economies?
Well, the gold standard had a lot to do with it. That Econ Lib piece does a really good job of explaining how it all worked.
So, like, if one country's economy started to tank, it would drag others down with it?
Exactly, like a domino effect. Plus, you have to remember that World War I had really shaken things up.
Mm.
New York was becoming the new financial center.
Taking over from London.
Yet London was struggling to maintain its grip. And some countries were trying to go back to the gold standard at those pre-war levels, which put a lot of strain on them.
Okay, so let's shift focus to the U.S. for a bit. Those roaring 20s, right? The classic narrative is all about that booming consumer demand, rising debt, and that crazy stock market.
And, History.com sums that up pretty well.
But then we get to this paper from Barnard, and it paints a slightly different picture.
What's interesting is that in 1927 and 1928, there was just this incredible wave of optimism.
Like everyone was drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, pretty much. Everyone thought the good times would last forever.
Did they not see any warning signs?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Were there signs they missed, or were they just completely blindsided by the crash?
It makes you wonder if something similar could happen today.
Now, to really get into that question, we have to bring in the Austrian School of Economics.
This is where the Mises book comes in.
Right. They have this whole theory about business cycles, and it suggests that what the Federal Reserve was doing back then, especially with inflation.
Inflating the currency.
Yeah, they were trying to help out Great Britain, but it actually fueled this artificial boom.
So, like, things looked good on the surface?
But it wasn't really based on real sustainable growth.
And then what happened?
Well, according to the Austrian school, the bust was actually a good thing, in a way.
How so?
It was the market correcting itself, getting rid of all those bad investments and getting things back on track.
So, a painful but necessary process.
Exactly. It's like hitting a reset button. And this is important because it ties into their whole view of how President Hoover handled the situation.
Ah, yes, Hoover. Didn't he try to stabilize things with that bank holiday?
He did. But the Mises book argues that many of his policies actually made things worse in the long run.
Like, he was trying to help, but he ended up messing things up.
In their view, yes. All those public works programs, prepping up wages, and those protectionist tariffs like Smoot-Hawley.
They see that as interfering with a market's ability to correct itself.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the gold standard.
Right, how all those economies were tied together.
Well, the Mises book also gets into how the Fed was inflating the currency in the 1920s, partially to help Great Britain stay on gold.
It's all connected, isn't it?
It is. And it's more complicated than you might think.
Makes you realize just how interconnected the world was, even back then.
And remember, that LSE paper pointed out that even countries not on the gold standard, like Spain, they suffered too.
So the Depression wasn't just a gold standard problem.
Nope, it was something bigger, a perfect storm of factors. And one of the biggest debates that still rages today is about deflation.
Deflation, like prices going down.
Yeah. The Mises book lays out the Austrian argument that deflation, while painful, is actually a necessary part of that correction process.
So they think the government shouldn't try to stop it.
That's their view. They say those efforts just prolong the pain.
Wow, that's a tough one.
It is. And it's a debate that's still going on today. Should governments intervene or let the market work it out?
Big questions. And it's not just theoretical. This stuff has real-world implications.
Absolutely. The Great Depression might be history, but its lessons are still very relevant today.
So, listeners, keep those questions in mind as we move forward in this deep dive.
You know, it's amazing how much debate there still is about the Great Depression.
Yeah, it really was a turning point, wasn't it?
Totally. And I think studying it can really help us understand how to deal with today's economic challenges.
You mean learn from their mistakes.
Exactly. Like, take that whole debate about government intervention.
Right. The Austrian school, those guys from the Mises book, they're pretty skeptical of that stuff.
Yeah, they'd say that Hoover's attempts to fix things actually backfired.
Like, he just made the Depression worse.
Well, that's what they argue. They believe those interventionist policies ended up distorting the natural market forces.
And delaying the recovery.
Right. From their perspective, it's all about letting the market work things out on its own.
But, there are other points of view, too, right? Like, what about FDR and the New Deal?
Oh, yeah, the New Deal was a huge shift, wasn't it? Massive government programs trying to stimulate the economy.
And provide relief for people who were struggling.
Exactly. And you can't deny that it had a big impact, both economically and psychologically.
Especially those fireside chats.
Oh, yeah, those were brilliant. Really helped restore a sense of hope and confidence.
So it's interesting, right? You've got the Austrian school saying, hands off.
And then you have the New Deal, which is all about government action.
It's a debate that we're still having today, isn't it?
Definitely. Trying to find that right balance,
When should the government intervene and when should they step back?
There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But I think understanding those different arguments is crucial if we want to make good decisions.
And you know what else the Great Depression highlights? The power of individual choices.
How so?
Well, remember that paper from Barnard? All that optimism in the late 1920s?
Oh, yeah. People thought the party would never end.
Exactly. And then when things started to go south, that fear and panic.
It just made everything worse.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Kind of. It just shows how much psychology matters in economics.
How our feelings, our perceptions can shape the whole system.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of that,
Yeah.
Are we being overly optimistic or are we letting fear take over?
That's a good point. Now, going back to that Mises book for a minute.
What about it?
Well, they really focus on the Fed's actions in the 1920s. How they inflated the currency.
The Austrian school sees that as a major cause of the crash.
Like they created this artificial boom that was bound to collapse.
Exactly. A house of cards.
And then there's that whole thing about trying to help Great Britain stay on the gold standard.
Oh, yeah, those secret meetings. All that behind-the-scenes maneuvering.
Makes you wonder, were those interventions really helpful or did they just make things worse in the long run?
It's hard to say for sure. But it's a good reminder that even the best intentions can have unintended consequences.
And one thing that surprised me, especially from the LSE paper, was just how global the Depression really was.
It wasn't just an American problem.
Nope, it was a worldwide phenomenon.
And that's something we have to remember today, too, right? We're all so interconnected now.
What happens in one country can have a ripple effect across the globe.
Exactly. We saw that with the 2008 financial crisis.
It's a reminder that we can't just focus on our own little corner of the world.
We have to be aware of what's happening everywhere.
And develop policies that take that global context into account.
Definitely. And, economic systems are incredibly complex.
They're constantly changing, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we can't just rely on old formulas or simple solutions.
What worked in the past might not work today.
And what works in one country might not work in another.
So we have to be adaptable, constantly learning and refining our approaches.
That's the key.
Okay, so we've explored a lot about the Great Depression. We've gone global, we've dug into U.S. policies, and we even got into that Austrian school view. But where does that leave us now? What's the takeaway for today?
Well, that Mises book, with its idea that booms set us up for busts, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What's booming right now that we might be overlooking?
It's easy to think, oh, it's different this time, but history's shown us those cycles, they keep coming back around. But I guess the point isn't just to predict the next depression, right?
Right. It's more about understanding the forces at work, seeing how things connect, and realizing the choices we make, they matter, both as individuals and as a whole society.
Because the depression wasn't just some random thing that happened, right?
No way. Specific policies, global stuff, and yeah, even how people were feeling, it all played a part. By studying it, we learn how economies work and hopefully how to navigate things better now.
So let's bring it back to those debates we talked about. Government intervention, the Austrian school saying stay out of it.
The Mises book really lays out that argument, how those policies messed things up, making it worse.
And that idea is still around today. A lot of people think markets can fix themselves, government should stay out.
Right. But on the other hand, you've got folks who think the government has to step in, stabilize things, help people out. Like, look at the New Deal, all those programs.
And regulation too, right? Making sure things are fair, addressing inequality.
Exactly. It's a complex issue. Both sides have good points. We got to avoid getting stuck in one way of thinking.
Stay open-minded, see all the angles, right?
Exactly. Weigh the costs and benefits, be flexible, adapt to whatever's happening.
And watch out for those unintended consequences, right? Like with the Fed trying to help Great Britain and the gold standard, sometimes even good intentions go wrong.
For sure. We got to be humble, admit we don't know everything, and be ready to change course if needed.
Okay, let's not forget that LSE paper, though. It really challenged that idea that the Depression was just an American thing.
It was global, impacting even countries that weren't on the gold standard. We got to see the bigger picture.
And that's huge today, with the world so connected.
Absolutely. Like 2008, the financial crisis, it showed us one country's problems, they can spread fast.
We can't ignore what's happening elsewhere, got to keep our eyes open.
And realize those events, they impact us too. We got to factor that in when making decisions, coming up with policies.
So as we wrap this up, I want you to think about the risks we face today, economically speaking. What are the weak spots? And what can we learn from the Great Depression to deal with them?
Good questions to think about. The main thing I'd say is history might not repeat itself exactly, but there are patterns.
Rhymes, like you said before.
Yeah, by studying the past, we understand the present better, and hopefully we're more prepared for whatever's coming next.
Well said. And on that note, one last thought. That Mises book, they said booms lead to busts. So look around. What do you see booming right now? And what can we learn so we don't repeat those same old mistakes? Until next time, keep diving deep.